Welcome to the Woman with a Movie Camera Summit. My name is Anna Bogutskaya. I'm a writer and podcaster, and it is without any hyperbole an absolute dream come true to introduce and host this conversation with Karina Longworth, the creator and host of the hit podcast You Must Remember This. You Must Remember This is the podcast dedicated to exploring the secret and or forgotten histories of Hollywood's first century. Since it first launched in 2014, it has become one of the go-to shows for cinephiles. We're extremely grateful to Karina for giving up some of her time to talk to us as part of the summit, and I'm personally very honored to be hosting this conversation. Karina's work, and You Must Remember This in particular, have been a huge inspiration for me since the moment it began, and proves that there's a way to creatively, thoughtfully, and intelligently engage with film history and make it accessible for new audiences. So join us, won't you, for a conversation with Karina Longworth. Karina, thank you so much for giving up a little bit of your time to join us at the Woman with the Movie Camera Summit this year. It's truly an honor for me personally to be speaking to you. I've been listening to You Must Remember This, I'm pretty sure since the very start of the podcast.
Oh,
And it's
great.
been a
Thank you.
huge reason for me as well to get into podcasting myself and to really start engaging with that particular format of broadcasting and all the creative possibilities of it. So,
Cool. I'm glad.
well, thank you. Um, and to kind of start our conversation, I wanted to go a little bit back before the beginning of You Must Remember This and ask about your own relationship with cinema growing up. And when did it go from being a fan to something you wanted to actively participate in and contribute to?
Well, I mean, I definitely was interested in the history of Hollywood and sort of old movies my whole life. And I went to art school as an undergraduate, and the schools that I went to, we didn't really watch a lot of old Hollywood movies. We watched more like the history of experimental film and personal filmmaking, foreign
Mm,
film or non-American film, documentaries. And so I was sort of seeing, the wide range of possibilities of what the medium could do, but I also felt like I was missing something. Of I really wanted to sort of understand the trajectory of Hollywood cinema better, and so I ended up going to graduate school where I got a degree in cinema studies, but I specialized in American cinema of the 20th century, and
mhm.
specifically sort of the star system and how that impacted the movies. And so then I was just sort of at this crossroads where I could have either continued in school and gotten a PhD and become an academic, or I could get a job. And before my graduate degree was even finished, I started finding work writing about new movies on the internet.
Mhm.
And so it was sort of decided for me, and I kind of, became a film critic and wrote about new movies for 10 years. But all the way through that time, I, just kind of took every opportunity I had to write about retrospectives or sort of stars of the past, DVD releases, things like that. And I just got to the point where I didn't want to write about the new movies anymore. I only wanted to write about the old movies.
And what about podcasting? What were you interested in the format before you started making You Must Remember This?
So you must remember this is not the first podcast I did.
Mhm.
I found out about podcasting in 2005 at South by Southwest, which is I attended that festival when I was writing for a website called Cinematical. And
Mhm.
at Cinematical, we did some sort of experiments in podcasting. And then after Cinematical, I worked for a company called Spout, which was trying to be a social network for cinephiles. And before I even joined Spout, their podcast was nominated for a Webby. And so I was on Spout's podcast every week.
Mhm.
Sometimes it was in conversation with the other two hosts. And then sometimes I would sort of write and record my own segments, which were kind of like proto versions of You Must Remember This, except that they were usually about newer movies.
Mhm.
So I had that experience dating back to, I think, what a lot of people would say would be the beginning of podcasting, or at least,
Mhm.
the first wave of mainstream podcasting. And then I just over the years, I was increasingly listening to more podcasts, and when it got to be the spring of 2014 and I was at kind of another career crossroads, I realized that I was more interested in acquiring information through podcasts than I was from reading blogs or
Mhm.
newspapers or websites or anything. And so that's when I started thinking about launching You Must Remember This.
And can you speak a little bit about that, the genesis of You Must Remember This? Like, was it a response to something that you felt like wasn't there in that existing in the podcast medium? Or like how did it go from, an idea to, oh, this is the format, this is what I want to focus on, this is how I want to tell these stories that I'm interested in?
Well, there definitely wasn't anything like it at the time in 2014. The only movie podcasts that I knew about at that time were like talk shows,
Hmm.
or they were, maybe people were getting like filmmakers being interviewed, or it was just usually two men talking about movies.
Yep.
And so there wasn't really anything about the history of Hollywood, and there wasn't really anything that was kind of composed the way that I thought I would want to do. And I don't really know what to say about it because I wasn't thinking of it as being something I would do long term necessarily.
Hmm.
I just started kind of hearing what it would sound like in my head, and then I thought, let me see if I can try to make that. And I
Hmm.
did, and then I put out the first episode, and people were very encouraging, and so I made
Hmm.
a couple more episodes, and then it just got a lot of attention right away.
And I wanted to kind of start talking really about You Must Remember This a bit more in detail. And I've been listening, like I said, since I'm pretty sure 2014 when it first started. And I've been re-listening to some of the older episodes in preparation for this. And I wanted to ask, the earlier seasons of You Must Remember This were kind of standalone stories, so an episode, two episodes, three about a particular story, and then kind of shifted into bigger seasons. So when did that shift happen for you creatively?
Well, really, I think it's only the first maybe dozen episodes that are total one-offs.
Mhm.
And then there's another chunk of episodes that are all related to this book I worked on called Hollywood Frame by Frame, which was a book of contact sheets of the
Mhm.
photographs taken on the sets of classic movies. And then after that, I started doing like really sort of full seasons. So it was really just kind of finding what the format of the show was and figuring out how I could kind of organize my research so that it would be sustainable from week to week so that I could sort of make a bunch of episodes, rather than just like do an episode and then start completely from scratch with research as soon as that episode
Mhm.
was finished.
And can you talk a bit? I've genuinely been always so curious about this listening to your show. What does your research process look like?
It really depends on what the
Mhm.
subject is, but I guess the general thing is that I just try to read everything that I can about whatever the subject is, and just try to know everything.
And I also wanted to ask you, you write, you narrate, you produce each episode. What drives you to maintain this level of creative control over the show?
I guess I don't really know what the alternative would be. There's like nobody
Mm.
else can do those things on this show.
Mhm.
It has to be me. There's just no one else who can do it.
From that, really, how do you manage the amount of not just the research and the work that goes into the making of the show, but there is an amount of labor, both intellectual and emotional, that it takes to produce something like that, and with so much of it kind of relying on yourself. How do you manage that amount of labor for yourself?
I'm very busy. Yeah, it takes a lot of time. But I also work on other projects all the time as well. So I don't know. I guess I'm just somebody who likes to be busy and likes
Hmm.
to I don't like I've gone through periods where I've, thought I needed a break, and but then I immediately just start looking for other work to do. So I don't know, maybe I don't understand the question because it doesn't feel like it's something really to manage. It's just more like
Hmm.
I just really like to be busy.
And how do you handle the I guess maybe another way of asking this, because it's something that I think about in my own work as well, is how do you manage the different tasks or the multiple projects at the same time? Is there a shift from you between, like writing, researching, doing the managing of, of your team and the bits, the nitty-gritty production bits that go into producing a podcast, and then all the other projects that you do alongside You Must Remember This?
So with You Must Remember This, like, I guess I just like to do things chronologically, and so I like to write
Hmm.
the whole season and then record it, and then I, work with an editor to make the episodes. But that's, I mean, I don't want to say like it's not a lot of work, because it is a lot of work,
Hmm.
but the process is really simple. Things get complicated when you're collaborating with more people.
Hmm.
And then you have to take into account everybody else's schedules. And I'm working on a project right now, which is a collaboration with a lot of people. And like, there's a lot of meetings. And I don't think most meetings are necessary. I think meetings can usually be emails. So that's certainly something where it's like I've had to kind of compromise in order to have these big group meetings that other people want to do. Whereas what I would prefer to do is just kind of work by myself and get stuff done.
Hmm. And I wanted to ask you about the actual format of You Must Remember This. And there's such a distinctive mood to it that has been there from the very beginning. And I love the way that, if I can quote yourself back to yourself for a second, I love the way that you describe it in this New York Times piece where you said we're going to basically have this goofy seance for 40 minutes, and in the middle you'll listen to an ad for mail order wine, which I thought was such a funny way of describing the show and the format of the podcast itself. Can you talk a little bit about the style of the show? Did it kind of come to you fully formed, or was it a bit of a trial and error for you until you found the groove for the show?
I wish we still had ads for mail order wine. Unfortunately, the quality of podcast ads seems to have gone down over the years. Um, yeah, I honestly, I gotta say, I just heard it in my head, and then I figured out how to make it. Like it
Mm,
was always, this was always what it was going to sound like.
mhm,
And I guess the only difference is that sometimes some seasons sort of demand more types of audio. Like when I did the
mhm,
Polly Platt season, I had a lot of questions that the available materials couldn't answer. And so I had to interview people to
mhm,
like tell the story fully. Um, and some other seasons would involve like a lot of movie clips, or like when I did the Gene Seberg and Jane Fonda season, there
mhm,
were clips of those, lots of interview clips of them speaking, which you're not always able to find, especially for subjects that are earlier than say the 1960s.
mm,
So I try to kind of vary the sound of the show a little bit based on what materials are available and what I need in order to tell the story. But like the season that's happening right now, the Gossip Girl season,
mhm,
I mean, it's really bare bones in terms of the sound, because there just isn't a lot of, there was no one to interview except for I interviewed an expert in, I interviewed a journalist named Rachel Syme, who's an expert in
mhm,
the gossip columnist Sheila Graham, um, because I just knew that she knew so much about Sheila, and I almost felt like
mhm,
I couldn't tell this story without her help. But otherwise it's just kind of like the almost original idea of the show, which is just me talking with some music behind
mhm.
it.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, not about the industry of podcasting yet, but it has become a really buzzy profession and a really buzzy industry over the last couple of years specifically. And I remember reading a few years back that you were kind of skeptical of building a permanent studio to record in, despite the massive success and reach of You Must Remember This. And I was wondering if your feelings on that have changed.
I don't think people understand the actual financials behind podcasts.
Hmm.
My podcast made the most money in 2018, and it's been declining ever since then. So yeah, certainly, like
Hmm.
I don't feel like it's at, like a curve that's still going up. I
Mm.
think that there's a real problem with podcast advertising right now, and I don't think it's going to be a sustainable way for shows to continue to exist. I mean, certainly, like I don't feel like the income that is coming in on the show right now via ads is commensurate with the amount of people who listen to it.
Mm.
Um, So on that level, it's not like it's really continuing to grow.
Hmm.
That said, like I did, I don't know when you were talking about that interview that I said, but I mean, like probably really close to that. I, started recording like I think it was probably right around the time that I moved into the house that I live in now, and I just started
Hmm.
recording in like a very specific closet. And then recently, about a year ago, like I did a few things to make that closet a little bit more comfortable. Like I put like a rug on the floor, and I sort of built a shelf, and I put some acoustic foam on the walls. So I mean
Mm.
that's as permanent of a recording setup as I'll probably ever have. But then right now, so that is in my house in Los Angeles right now.
Mm.
I'm with my husband for his work in Europe, and so I just have a microphone set up in like the closet where I keep my clothes here.
Hmm.
Um, so it's there's a certain aspect of podcasting that is nice, which is that I can kind of do it from anywhere, and it doesn't need that kind of permanency.
And what you mentioned a little bit about your thoughts on the evolution of podcasting into this industry now. What do you think of how it's evolved so far, and kind of, not where it's going, but where it is now?
I don't really pay attention, to be honest. Like I don't really pay attention to the business around podcasts. I just can speak to my own personal experience. I don't
Hmm.
listen to like Joe Rogan or like I know that there are podcasts out there that make millions of dollars, but it's just so not part of my life. So all I can say is that my podcast was like pretty lucrative a couple years ago, and it's been diminishing returns over the past couple years. And it started before COVID, and COVID
Mm.
obviously didn't make anything better. And if the ad market is going to bounce back, at least for my show, it hasn't
Well, I definitely hope that it will.
yet.
But I also hope that you just continue making the show regardless. And I did want to ask you about audiences. And it's such a, even if you mentioned the kind of, maybe perhaps numbers are going down, I was wondering about how do you think of audiences when you first started, or did you start thinking about them a little bit into the life of the show? Do you think about them now? And if so, kind of, how do you keep them in mind?
I didn't in the beginning at all. I just
Hmm.
wanted to make a show that could sort of I felt like I couldn't explain to people what it
Hmm.
is that I knew how to do. And so in
Hmm.
order to explain it, I had to make it. So I wasn't
Hmm.
thinking about anybody, making anybody happy. And I don't think that I really have since then, to be honest. I mean,
Hmm.
sometimes I will take sort of feedback, here and there as a way of, trying to make the show better. But I don't really think about who's listening to the show at all. I mean, for advertising, we have to do demographic studies sometimes.
Hmm.
So I have some of that information, but I don't
Hmm.
really I don't really think about like, well, I have to appeal to people who are 24 years old.
Hmm.
I just kind of make the show that I want to make, and that because it's not going to be good and I'm not going to be able to have the energy to do it unless
Hmm.
I'm doing it about something that I'm super super invested and excited about.
And on that note, I kind of want to talk about the stories that you tell on You Must Remember This. Do you remember any particular season or particular story that you found especially either exciting or challenging to make?
Well, the Polly Platt season was the hardest for sure
Mm-hmm.
because it was a story that hadn't been told, and I had her unpublished, unfinished memoir, but because it was unfinished, there were a lot of holes to fill, and it had never been copy edited or anything like that, and so there
Mm-hmm.
was certain things where she would get a date wrong, and then I'd have to like
Mm-hmm.
sort of second guess this primary document I was using. And then it was just also like I had the memoir because her daughters gave it to me, and so I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
I certainly did not want them to be upset by what they heard, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time I wanted to have some kind of journalistic impartiality and tell the story fairly and represent the truth,
Mm-hmm.
and not worry too much about how the family felt about it. So there was a lot of things to juggle. And then plus I was making it, in the spring of 2020. And so I couldn't meet most of my interview subjects in person. We were just
Mm-hmm.
doing recording phone calls. And in some cases, I think that was good because there were a lot of the people I were talking to were, I would say, over the age of 60, and they were alone in
Mm-hmm.
their homes and they were very isolated, and they kind of needed somebody to talk to. But it was also, there's definitely certain people where I don't think I was able to get to them because of the sort of conditions of communication at that time. And I do wish that I had been able to do it under other circumstances.
And sticking on your Polly Platt season, I wanted to ask you as well about how did you approach recreating some of the voices in that story, specifically, I guess, Polly's.
I just really wanted to find an actress who I thought understood the material and connected to it. And
Mm-hmm.
I was really lucky to be introduced to Maggie Siff through my friend Karin Kusama, who directed
Mm-hmm.
Maggie in Billions. And Maggie was in this situation where she was like, she and her family had gone to like a country house. So they're outside of the city, and I think she was feeling a little, I don't know if stir crazy is the right word, but she wanted to have something sort of create, like a creative project to work
Mm-hmm.
on. And so we just really connected, and she really kind of got the material. And I think other actresses might have been afraid because some of what Polly says is very incendiary, but she wasn't. And she just, we would have conversations about some of the material so that we could kind of talk about like what Polly would have been thinking in this moment, or why she wrote things or said things in the way that she did. But Maggie was really open to exploring that stuff. She wasn't scared away by any of it. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was a fantastic collaboration.
And can you expand a little bit on how do you find and work with your collaborators? Especially, I'm interested in kind of this casting process for these real life figures that you build and tell the stories of on You Must Remember This. And occasionally they'll pop up as you're working with actors as well to represent them. So how do you cast your collaborators, I guess is my question.
Well, the show has never really made enough money to have a budget for that kind of
Mhm.
thing. And so it's really just I'm asking, usually friends or friends of friends to do a
Mm.
favor. And so, when you when you're limited to that kind of pool, the casting decisions, you really just have to think about like everybody who might be willing to say yes to do this, or people who are maybe 1 or 2 degrees separation away from you. And you just
Mhm.
think of those options, like who would be interesting, who would be funny, how would it work? I mean, on this current season, Luella Parsons is being played by Julie Klausner, who's an old friend of
Mhm.
mine. And I just knew I wanted her to be part of it. And so I
Mm.
gave her the scripts for the whole show, and I said, you can play either Luella or Hedda. I don't care either way. I think you'd be fantastic. And so she chose to play Luella. And then I was like, do you have any suggestions about who could play Hedda? And she suggested a couple people, and one of them was Cole Escola, who I knew from her show,
Mm.
Difficult People, and then I'd also seen them in a few other things. And so I reached out to them, and Cole just, was really great and really excited to do it. And I think
Mm.
they're so funny as Hedda and so perfect. And I'm just really happy to have both Cole and Julie on the show.
No, I think they're both fantastic on the show. And I wanted to kind of I mean, this might be even more of a, I guess, a directing question. Like, how do you direct them to perform as, as Hedda, as Luella?
I didn't have to do much. I did a live session with Julie. Like, she was in New
Mm-hmm.
York and I was in Los Angeles. And I would, sort of help her find the voice, and coached a couple of the line readings. But with performers who are that good, you don't really have to do much. A lot of it is more just helping them understand the material. Like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, especially when you have quotes that people said in the 1930s or 40s, people spoke in a different way then.
Mm,
Some of these quotes are from newspaper columns, and so they were
mm,
things that were written and not necessarily said out loud. And so some of it is just finding which word do you emphasize?
mm,
What kind of rhythm does this sentence need? And some of it is explaining like what do you think they meant by this word,
mm,
so that you just really understand what, like, because in some cases people kind of speak in code. They don't necessarily say literally what they mean. They say other words that imply what they mean or hint at what they mean or talk around what they mean. And so when you are asking somebody to perform that kind of language, sometimes you have to translate for them, this is what they're
mhm.
really saying.
And kind of sticking on a little bit on the Gossip Girl season and on the Polly Platt season as well. I kind of have to ask because this conversation is part of the Women with a Movie Camera Summit. So they're obviously female-led stories. And what I found very fascinating about was not just the lives of Polly and Luella and Hedda, but their relationship to power in Hollywood. Um, and I was wondering kind of how do you approach these stories that are either untold or have been told in a very specific kind of perhaps limited way before?
Well, so with Polly's story, I think that when people did speak of her in other narratives about the movie she worked on, it was usually
Mm,
as Peter Bogdanovich's wife.
mhm,
And I think her body of work previous to my podcast was maybe understood as these movies she made with Peter. And I think that there was a lot to be said for kind of creating an overall arc to her career.
mhm,
And especially bringing to light her collaboration with James L. Brooks, and then some of the other things that she did with that she where she was really able to put her stamp on the work. Like for instance, in when she did the production design for the Barbara Streisand version of A Star Is Born, she found ways to bring her own autobiography into her design of that movie. And that's the kind of thing that we usually give directors credit for. But in this case, it was Polly having had her own experience with a husband who died and her deciding that a portion of the movie, including the death of the Chris Christopherson character, should take place in the same Arizona desert where she had that own experience. And so that's the kind of thing that, like, it's just something that people would never talk about because they would never put together the details of that movie with the details of the production designer's biography. And then with Hedda and Luella, their stories are not untold at all. I just
mhm.
think that people don't necessarily talk about them. They've become kind of obscure figures that are maybe known only to classic cinephiles. And my approach to them was I wanted to kind of bring out the aspects of their careers and their personal lives and everything surrounding them in the newspaper industry and in Hollywood that reflects and has a conversation with things that are happening today.
And can you expand a little bit on that, on the Gossip Girl season and kind of how, I mean, they are familiar figures to cinephiles and to people who love old Bollywood stories and stuff, but how did you what made me kind of choose them at this particular moment?
I was trying to figure out what this next season would be. I was working on this in the fall of 2020, and I had
Mhm,
5 or 6 ideas. And in order to figure out if I'm going to do a season, I have to do a lot of research to
mhm,
sort of figure out what the arc of the story would be and how many episodes it would be, and kind of what it's about in addition to what it's about. So
mhm,
I had all these different ideas, and I decided to just focus on two. And the ones that I chose are the Gossip Girls, and then the season that's going to come out in the fall. And I chose those things basically because they both stories seem like they reflected things that were happening in the world in the fall of 2020. And I guess I'll be lucky if they still feel relevant when you hear the episodes. But in terms of Gossip Girls, I was doing that research during the time of the American presidential election, and I was thinking a lot about bias in news
mhm,
and the ways in which the news is controlled by so few people because of newspaper consolidation and just the
Mm-hmm.
way, even with the proliferation of the internet, there's so much that is sort of filtered through Facebook, or the ways that I think people get their news in many different ways, but they don't really understand that so many of those different outlets kind of all point back to a few very specific sort of powerful people
Mm-hmm.
who use the media to further their own interests.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just stuff that was all over Luella and Hedda's stories, because of the fact that Luella worked for William Randolph Hearst and Hedda was part of the Los Angeles Times newspaper organization. And so I just immediately saw, this kind of great, not mythology, that's not the right word because it's real, it's not fake,
Mm-hmm.
but it like this sort of tapestry of stuff, Citizen Kane and Chinatown and
Mm-hmm.
all of these things are kind of connected in that way. And then on top of that, I could actually do something that seemed useful for me personally, for my own
Mm-hmm.
personal development, which was understanding once and for all that Luella and Hedda were two different people. Because I think that, I talk in the first episode about the
Mm-hmm.
Coen brothers movie Hail Caesar, in
Yeah.
which there's two gossip columnists and their twin sisters, both played by Tilda Swinton. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that reflects this idea that a lot of people have about Luella and Hedda, which is that they were kind of a two-headed monster, and two halves of the same whole, when actually, even though they had a few things in common, they were very different. They had very different goals and purposes and functions within
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood. And they also, even though they overlapped for a couple of decades, Luella got a 20-year head start on Hedda. And so she's kind of part of a different era. So all of that was just stuff that I had to learn for myself, and thought it would be good to communicate.
Is that the most exciting thing for you? That kind of connecting of the dots of recognizable moments or really, really important moments in Hollywood history to the personal and the professional lives of these people that you're, researching, investigating. That sounds like a
Yeah.
bizarre word to use, but I think it's kind of appropriate.
I don't know if that is my favorite thing. I think that my favorite thing is learning things that I didn't know, and
Mm-hmm.
then finding ways to explain those things,
Mm.
using comparisons and contrasting them to things that are more contemporary.
And what do you think, kind of, I'd love to hear that. Well, with your contemporary connection with the Polly Platt season in particular, because listening to you explain your process behind the Gossip Girl season makes complete sense. So if you can you talk about your kind of connective tissue to contemporary world with the Polly Platt season?
Well, I didn't do that season because of anything happening in the world. I did that season
Mm,
because I was given her memoir. But I think certainly the experience that she had of being a woman who didn't always get the right credit for her work, who was working in a mostly male environment, and was kind of caught in this catch 22 of wanting to make movies better with the talents that she had, but also not wanting to suffer for the sexism of the time, of
mhm,
trying to be a working mother, and always feeling like she was either failing as a mother or failing at work, sometimes both.
mm.
I think these are things that haven't gone away, and that, a lot of us can relate to.
Oh, 100%. And maybe a little too much, but I did want to ask you as well, kind of, perhaps thinking about some of the prior seasons, and you speak so much about kind of wanting to learn new things, and that being your favorite part about the making of the show. What was the most surprising season to make for you? What was the season that you think you learned the most from?
Probably the Song of the South season.
Mm,
Um, there's so much in that. I didn't know anything about the history of the song Zippity Doo Dah and how it relates
mm-hmm,
back to minstrel culture and tropes from minstrel shows.
mm-hmm,
I hadn't known anything about minstrel shows, really. I hadn't known that, in America, we have what we call the Jim Crow era, or Jim Crow laws, which were laws of racism and segregation. I didn't know that Jim Crow was a minstrel character, that he was from minstrel shows, this stereotype of this sort of shifty, lazy Black person. So just, maybe it's white ignorance, but I also think it's we weren't taught that kind of thing in school. Like the pictures that we were sort of given of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era were very different and often excluded this kind of information. And so when you then have that stuff popping up in an animated Disney film, children are not supposed to connect those dots. But speaking from the future, you can connect them for people. So there's that, but then also just even the story of Hattie McDaniel's whole career before she started popping up as maids and slaves and in Marlene Dietrich movies and stuff. Hadn't known anything about the fact that she had created her own vaudeville shows, her own shows that were using kind of the mammy stereotype and subverting them. So there's just so much in that season where it was stuff that it was a real research project for me. And when you say that something's surprising, it's almost beyond that, because I didn't even know what I didn't know.
I can only imagine. There's something that I always think about when I listen to You Must Remember This, and I wanted to ask you, what has the making of the show taught you about Hollywood's relationship to truth?
I think that this show hasn't taught me as much as being around contemporary Hollywood has taught me, but maybe the two things have worked together. I just feel like over the past 10 years, I've just kind of acquired a real sense. And this started when I was a newspaper reporter at the LA Weekly, and it's only grown over time. I just have a real sense that in Hollywood, nobody has any incentive to tell the truth. It's certainly not to the public. And, even behind the scenes, I think that there's, sort of quite a bit of spin. So I talk about this in the Gossip Girl season, where Hollywood at the beginning really felt like they had a huge incentive to obscure how movies were really made, because they thought people wouldn't go see them if they understood that there were things like stuntmen. And I don't, as much as there has sort of ebbed and flowed over time an industry of behind the scenes reporting, I just don't think that has fundamentally changed. I don't think that Hollywood has any incentive to really pull back the curtain and have their consumers understand how movies are made, and especially what goes on behind the scenes financially. And I think they do everything they can to obscure that stuff. And when you do see something in Variety or the Hollywood Reporter, and to a lesser extent, even the Los Angeles Times, where, let's say Scott Rudin is being called out for bad behavior or something like that, there has been a decision that this is fine to do because that person or anybody who's being named in that story is not going to create more money for the power structure anytime soon. People, like, the truth is only told when there's nothing left to lose.
Yeah, that's a dispiriting truth, but I do agree with you. And I kind of wanted to ask you on the back of that, do you think it applies in a similar way to the past, to the history that Hollywood tells about itself?
Well, yeah, I mean, all of this stuff has been happening forever, for sure.
I wanted kind of, as we start wrapping up, I know we've only got a few minutes left. I wanted to talk a little bit perhaps about what else you would like You Must Remember This to be. And I've read an interview with you where you mentioned that you like to develop it into a TV show, and I was wondering if that's something that we might be able to see in the near future.
No. I did sell the Manson season to a network, and we did a writer's room, and ultimately that network decided not to make the show. And I've been wanting to do a documentary TV version of You Must Remember This. I had a bunch of meetings over the past year. As of now, no one is interested in making that show. So I'm working on another adaptation of another season, which I hope that, actually two of them, which I hope that something will happen with. But I mean, you know, certainly there's nothing that is in production and there's nothing to report.
I mean, rude of television streamers to not commission that right away.
Well, if anybody's listening, you know, I'm available for a Zoom meeting.
Yes, please. Anybody listening, just straight away, just give Karina the commission. But I did actually want to mention, ask on that front, like, why You Must Remember This is basically creative nonfiction in my eye. It's like I think not just a podcast. There is very thoughtful. It's very, in hearing you talk about just how you hear it in your head, and then the best way to explain it is just to mention, makes sense even as a listener. So I'm wondering, kind of, you've mentioned that you'd like to do it as a documentary or documentary series. Do you think is there a particular reason why perhaps the TV documentary format attracts you in the same way as you knew that it needed to sound this way with a podcast?
I don't know. I mean, it's just sort of something to do. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't think I really have a good answer for that question.
That's okay. That's fine. It actually, it's kind of refreshing to hear, actually, Karina. And I think the audience for this event and for the Women with Movie Camera Summit is mostly younger women and interested in film, of course. And I wanted to ask if there's anything you'd wish someone told you, or that you wish you'd heard, or something that you'd just like to say to women who are interested in film history or in Hollywood history, how to engage with that.
I guess I don't really think of things that way. You know, I don't know. I never really had any kind of stigma against being interested in classic films, although I know a lot of people do feel like it's not, you know, something that's necessarily that easy to be accepted into. I'm sorry, I don't have anything inspirational to say.
Is there a series or an episode of You Must Remember This that would be a good starting point for young women who are interested in old Hollywood history?
I guess it just depends on what they're interested in. What I usually tell people is to just, you know, go to the iTunes and scroll down the list and like start with whatever name pops out to them first that they're excited to learn more about. You know, I think a lot of people get into this show via the Manson season because it's sort of this, it's perceived as being this hybrid between true crime and Hollywood history. And for whatever reason, stories about murder are more accessible than stories about the history of Hollywood. But if you're already interested in the history of Hollywood, you know, I mean, maybe something like Dead Blondes gives you a combination of people whose stories you might be a little bit familiar with, like Marilyn Monroe, with more obscure figures like a Carol Landis or a Veronica Lake. And that's also an interesting one where it spans a long period of time. So it starts in the silent era and it ends with the Playboy Mansion in the 1980s. So that kind of gives you a lot to work with, and you can sort of skip around to the things that you're most interested in while kind of staying within a theme.
Fantastic. Karina, thank you so much for your time and for your honesty and for sharing some of your process behind the making of You Must Remember This. I'm not gonna gush again, I promise, but I do really, really genuinely appreciate your time and just hearing you talk about what goes into it, and how sometimes, even, you know, from my side, sometimes we mystify people who make stuff that we love. And sometimes you just hear it in your head and you want to make it, and that's all you need.
Well, thank you so much. This was fun.
I'm glad to hear that. And yeah, I really, really appreciate your time.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this conversation. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you seek out You Must Remember This and enjoy the rest of the summit.